In 1909, one man controlled more railroad track than anyone in American history. Edward H. Harriman owned over 60,000 miles of track. That's enough to circle the earth 2.5 times. His empire was worth approximately $200 million, equivalent to $6.7 billion in today's money. And that's being conservative. He controlled the Union Pacific, the Southern Pacific, the Illinois Central, the Central Pacific. He had his hands in banking, shipping, and land development across the entire American West. The Harriman name stood alongside Rockefeller, Morgan, and Vanderbilt. But here's what nobody tells you. Within just 3 generations, almost all of it was gone. Not from a single scandal, not from one bad investment, but from something far more insidious, something that's still destroying wealthy families today. And here's what no one's talking about. The fall didn't start with obvious mistakes. It started the moment E. H. Harriman closed his eyes for the last time on September 9, 1909, at his estate in upstate New York. What happened next is a masterclass in how dynasties crumble. If you're ready to see what really happened, with the actual numbers, the hidden decisions, and the devastating mistakes that academics barely mention, let's begin. Let me show you exactly how powerful the Harriman Empire was. By 1906, Edward H. Harriman had accomplished something unprecedented. He didn't just own railroads, he controlled the arteries of American commerce. His Union Pacific Railroad alone carried 15% of all freight traffic west of the Mississippi. That's not a small percentage. That's economic dominance. The Southern Pacific Railroad, which he acquired in 1901, added another 9,000 miles to his network. Combined, these two systems employed over 100,000 workers. To put that in perspective, that's more employees than Amazon had until 2015. Here's the number that matters. At the height of his power, Harriman's railroad empire generated approximately $350 million in annual revenue. In today's dollars, that's roughly $11.7 billion per year. But revenue isn't wealth. Let's talk about actual assets. His rail network was valued at $200 million minimum, possibly as high as $300 million depending on the assessment. Real estate holdings across the western United States added another $50 million to $75 million. Banking interests, stock portfolios, and industrial investments brought the total family fortune to somewhere between $70 million and $100 million in liquid assets. Now here's what makes this extraordinary. While the Rockefellers were worth more and J.P. Morgan controlled more capital, Harriman had something they didn't. He had complete operational control over the physical infrastructure that moved goods across half the continent. Control, not just ownership control. When you controlled the railroads in 1900, you controlled commodity prices, shipping costs, and access to markets. You decided which towns thrived and which ones died. You determined whether a mining operation succeeded or failed based on freight rates. That's real power. And it all depended on one thing: Edward H. Harriman's relentless, hands-on, aggressive management style. He negotiated personally. He toured his lines constantly. He made snap decisions worth millions. He fought legal battles against the federal government. He outmaneuvered J.P. Morgan himself in the Northern Pacific corner of 1901, a battle that nearly crashed the entire stock market. But here's the real problem that nobody saw coming. The entire empire was built around one man's ability to manage complexity. And that man was about to die September 9th, 1909. Arden House, New York. Edward H. Harriman died at age 61 from stomach cancer. And in that moment, the Harriman Empire faced an existential crisis that would take decades to fully manifest. Here's what happened immediately. The stock market panicked. Union Pacific shares dropped 8% in a single day. Southern Pacific fell 6%. Investors knew exactly what this meant. The man was the system, and the man was gone. Now, Harriman left behind a complex web of holdings. His estate was valued at approximately $70 million to $100 million. Let's call it $2.8 billion in today's money. That's substantial wealth, even by modern standards. But here's the part historians gloss over. Most of that wasn't liquid cash sitting in bank accounts. It was tied up in railroad stocks, bonds, real estate, and ongoing business operations that required constant, expert management. His widow, Mary Averell Harriman, inherited the bulk of the estate. His son, William Averell Harriman, known as Averell, was only 17 years old at the time. 17 years old. Let me be clear about what Averell inherited. Not just money, but the expectation of continuing a dynasty. The responsibility of managing one of the largest transportation networks in the world. The pressure of living up to a father who had been called the most hated man in America by his enemies and the greatest railroad genius of his time by his admirers. But Averell Harriman was not his father. Young Averell was educated at Groton and Yale. He was cultured, well-mannered, and interested in rowing crew. He was everything a proper East Coast aristocrat should be. What he wasn't was a ruthless railroad tycoon. And here's the critical mistake that set everything in motion. Instead of installing experienced railroad management, instead of bringing in a team of executives who understood the industry the way E.H. Harriman had, the family tried to maintain control themselves while relying on a board of directors who lacked the founder's vision. The Union Pacific and Southern Pacific Railroads continued operating, of course. They had momentum. They had infrastructure. They had thousands of employees who knew their jobs, but they no longer had strategic leadership. And in business, momentum without direction is just slow-motion collapse. Wait a minute, because this is where the real story begins. Most accounts of the Harriman family say they remained wealthy after E.H. died. They point to Averell's later political career as proof of continued prosperity. They mention the family's estates and social standing, but that's not the full picture, not even close. Let me show you what actually happened to the money. By 1920, Averell Harriman was 28 years old. He had graduated from Yale. He had briefly worked in railroad management. He had married into another wealthy family, Kitty Lanier Lawrence, whose father was a prominent New York financier, and he had begun to make a choice that would drain the family fortune for the next 5 decades. He chose politics over profit. Now, understand what this meant in practical terms. While families like the Rockefellers were ruthlessly reinvesting profits into new ventures, oil, banking, real estate, Averell Harriman was spending, let me give you the numbers. In 1924, Averell invested heavily in the Democratic National Convention. Exact figures are difficult to confirm, but estimates suggest he spent between $250,000 and $500,000, roughly $4.4 million to $8.8 million today, supporting various candidates and causes. That's just 1 year. In 1928, he backed Al Smith's presidential campaign. More donations, more fundraising events at his estates, more money flowing out rather than being reinvested for growth. But here's what nobody's talking about. These weren't just campaign contributions. Averell was funding an entire lifestyle of political influence. He maintained multiple residences. The family estate at Arden, New York, a 20,000-acre property with a 100-room mansion, a townhouse in Manhattan, properties in Europe. Each one required staff, maintenance, property taxes, and constant upkeep. Conservative estimates suggest the Arden estate alone cost between $200,000 and $400,000 annually to maintain. That's $3.5 million to $7 million per year in today's money, just for one property. Now multiply that by multiple estates and decades of political ambition. Let's look at his political career spending more carefully. In 1933, Averell took a position in Franklin D. Roosevelt's New Deal administration government service. Public duty, noble work. It also paid almost nothing compared to what he could have earned managing the family businesses. From 1933 to 1946, 13 years, Averell served in various government roles: ambassador to the Soviet Union, secretary of commerce, special envoy to Europe. Here's the opportunity cost. During those same 13 years, the stock market recovered from the Depression. Between 1933 and 1946, The Dow Jones Industrial Average increased by over 250%. Anyone heavily invested in equities during that period multiplied their wealth several times over. But Avril wasn't focused on investments, he was focused on influence, and influence is expensive. By 1950, Avril had spent millions on political campaigns, his own and others. He ran for governor of New York in 1952, lost, ran again in 1954, won, served one term, ran for president in 1952 and 1956, lost both times. Each campaign cost money, significant money. Presidential campaigns in the 1950s could easily cost $2 million to $5 million for a serious candidate. That's $24 million to $60 million in today's dollars. And Avril lost repeatedly. But that wasn't the real problem. The real problem was this. While he was spending millions on politics, the railroad industry was fundamentally changing, and nobody in the Harriman family was paying attention. Now let's look at the financial crash that historians always mention but rarely quantify properly. October 1929. The stock market collapsed, and the Harriman family holdings got devastated. Here are the actual numbers. Union Pacific Railroad stock was trading at $268 per share in September 1929. By July 1932, it had fallen to $25 per share. That's a 91% decline. Southern Pacific Railroad followed a similar trajectory, from $135 per share in 1929 to $12 per share by 1932, a 91% loss. Let me put this in concrete terms. If the Harriman family held $50 million in railroad stocks in 1929, a conservative estimate given E.H. Harriman's holdings, by 1932, that portfolio was worth approximately $4.5 million, $45.5 million gone. Vanished, destroyed. But wait, it gets worse. The railroad industry wasn't just suffering from stock price declines, the actual businesses were collapsing. Freight traffic dropped by 50% between 1929 and 1932. Passenger traffic fell even harder, down 60%. Railroads across the country began declaring bankruptcy. Between 1929 and 1935, approximately one-third of all railroad track miles in the United States fell under receivership. The Union Pacific Railroad, the crown jewel of the Harriman Empire, nearly went bankrupt. Only aggressive restructuring and federal intervention saved it. Here's what this meant for the family. Dividends stopped. The steady income stream that had supported their lifestyle, their estates, their political ambitions, it dried up almost overnight. And unlike other wealthy families who diversified into different industries, the Harrimans were heavily concentrated in railroads. That concentration nearly destroyed them. But here's the part nobody's talking about. The Great Depression alone didn't end the Harriman dynasty. Other railroad families survived. The Vanderbilts, though diminished, maintained significant wealth. The Goulds adapted. The Astors, invested in real estate, actually thrived. So what was different about the Harrimans? The real reason wasn't just the Depression, it was that they were already weakened when it hit. Remember, Avril had been spending heavily on politics throughout the 1920s. The estates were burning through hundreds of thousands per year. There was no aggressive wealth-building strategy in place. When the crash came, they had no financial cushion, no diversification, no plan, just massive expensive properties and a lifestyle they could no longer afford. And then came the second wave of destruction, the cost of maintaining the illusion of wealth. Let me show you how real estate can destroy a fortune. The Harriman family's Arden estate in Orange County, New York, was one of the largest private land holdings on the East Coast, 20,000 acres. Forests, lakes, riding trails, hunting grounds, and at its center, a mansion with over 100 rooms. It was built to impress. It succeeded. But here's what impressive costs. A property that size required a full-time staff of 40 to 50 people minimum. Groundskeepers, stable hands, housekeepers, cooks, maintenance workers, security personnel. Each one received a salary. Conservative estimates suggest the annual payroll for estate staff ranged between $100,000 and $200,000 in the 1920s and 1930s. That's $1.75 million to $3.5 million per year in today's money. But payroll was just the beginning. Property taxes on 20,000 acres, heating a 100-room mansion through New York winters, maintaining roads, bridges, and infrastructure across the property. Repairs to buildings constructed in the 1890s and deteriorating with age added all up, and the Arden estate likely cost between $300,000 and $500,000 annually to maintain during the 1930s. Now, here's the math that destroyed them. During the Depression, the Harriman family's income from investments had collapsed. Dividends stopped. Stock portfolios were worth a fraction of their former value, but the expenses didn't stop. The staff still needed salaries. The property taxes still came due. The buildings still required heat and maintenance, and selling wasn't easy. Who was buying 20,000-acre estates during the Great Depression? Nobody. The market for luxury real estate had completely disappeared. The Harrimans were trapped. They owned assets worth millions on paper but generated no income and required constant expenditure. This is called being house poor, but at a dynasty-destroying scale. By the late 1930s, the family faced a brutal choice: pour more money into maintaining properties that would never generate returns or start selling. They chose to sell, piece by piece. In 1910, shortly after E.H. Harriman's death, the family donated 10,000 acres to New York State for what would become Harriman State Park. This is typically framed as philanthropy in historical accounts. But here's what they don't tell you. That donation provided a significant tax deduction at a time when the estate was facing massive inheritance taxes. It was as much financial strategy as generosity. By 1950, much of the remaining property had been sold or donated. The massive mansion fell into disrepair and was eventually demolished. What was once the symbol of Harriman power became a park where middle-class families could hike and picnic. Gone, disappeared, over. But the Arden estate wasn't the only property draining resources. Now let's talk about the Manhattan townhouse at 1 East 69th Street. This wasn't just a house. It was a 50-room mansion on Fifth Avenue, one of the most expensive addresses in America. Property taxes alone on a Fifth Avenue mansion during the 1930s and 1940s ranged from $30,000 to $60,000 annually. That's $630,000 to $1.26 million per year in today's dollars. Add staff, maintenance, utilities, and upkeep, and you're looking at another $100,000 to $150,000 annually in 1930s dollars. For a single townhouse that generated zero income, the family also maintained properties abroad, a villa in Europe, a winter residence in a warmer climate, each one another expense. And here's the kicker. During this entire period, Averell Harriman continued his political career, which meant constant entertaining. Dinner parties for political allies, fundraising events, hosting foreign dignitaries, all of this cost money, significant money. By the 1950s, the financial situation had become unsustainable. The townhouse was eventually sold to a foundation, more assets liquidated, more of the empire dismantled. But wait a minute, because we need to address something historians always gloss over. How could a family worth $100 million in 1909, equivalent to $2.8 billion today, run out of money in just a few decades? The math doesn't seem to add up, even with the Depression, even with expensive estates. And you're right to be skeptical, because there's another factor, one that's barely documented, one that family biographies mention only in passing: internal family conflicts over money, inheritance, and control. Here's what you won't find in most history books. The Harriman family wasn't a unified dynasty after E.H. died. It was a collection of individuals with different priorities, different values, and different ideas about what to do with the wealth. Mary Averell Harriman, the widow, controlled the estate initially. She had her own vision for the family's legacy, focused on philanthropy, social reform, and public service. Averell Harriman wanted political influence and power. The other children, there were 5 surviving children total, had their own interests and financial needs. And here's where it gets complicated. When you have a large fortune controlled by multiple heirs with different agendas, wealth gets fragmented quickly. Let me show you how this works. Each heir requires their own household, their own staff, their own properties, their own lifestyle expenses. Each heir has different investment priorities. Some want aggressive growth, others want conservative preservation, some need liquidity immediately for personal projects. Without unified management, without the iron-fisted control that E.H. Harriman exercised, the fortune gets divided into smaller portions that are individually managed with varying degrees of competence. And here's the real problem. Once wealth fragments across multiple heirs, the compounding effect that builds dynasties stops working. Think about it this way. If you have $100 million invested as a single unified portfolio with professional management, you might achieve 5% to 8% annual returns. That's $5 million to $8 million per year in growth, which can be reinvested for compound growth. But if you divide that $100 million among 5 heirs, each managing their own $20 million, several things happen. First, you lose economies of scale. Investment management becomes less efficient. Second, individual heirs make poor decisions. Maybe one heir loses money in a bad business venture. Another spends heavily on personal lifestyle. A third gets divorced and loses assets in the settlement. Third, the family brand deteriorates. When E.H. Harriman was alive, the Harriman name commanded respect and fear in business circles. After fragmentation, it becomes just another wealthy family name. By the 1940s and 1950s, this is exactly what had happened to the Harriman fortune. Averell was spending on politics. Other family members were pursuing their own interests. The railroad holdings were no longer generating significant wealth, and nobody was actively building new sources of income. Here's a specific example that illustrates this perfectly. In 1946, Averell Harriman became ambassador to the court of St. James, essentially the U.S. ambassador to the United Kingdom. Prestigious position, historically significant. It paid approximately $25,000 per year. At the same time, maintaining his lifestyle, the estates, the staff, the travel, the entertainment, likely cost him $200,000 to $300,000 per year. That's a $175,000 to $275,000 annual deficit every single year. Where did that money come from? From liquidating assets, selling stocks, reducing holdings, death by 1,000 cuts. And nobody's talking about this because family biographies focus on Averell's public service, his diplomatic achievements, his role in shaping post-World War II foreign policy, all admirable accomplishments, but financially ruinous for the dynasty. Now we're 2/3 through this story, and I need to tell you something important. Everything I've just described, the political spending, the depression losses, the expensive estates, the family fragmentation, is documented in historical records. But you rarely see it discussed in detail. Why? Let me give you the reasons nobody talks about the real Harriman family decline. Reason 1. It contradicts the public service narrative. Averell Harriman is remembered as a statesman, diplomat, and public servant. His biography emphasizes his role in negotiating with Stalin, his work on the Marshall Plan, his governorship of New York, discussing how his political career drained the family fortune, undercuts that heroic narrative. Historians and biographers focus on legacy, not balance sheets. Reason 2. The family maintained appearances for decades. Even as assets were liquidated and the fortune declined, the Harrimans continued to live in a manner that suggested enormous wealth. They kept the townhouse until it became absolutely necessary to sell. They maintained social connections with other old money families. They attended the right events, belonged to the right clubs, and presented a facade of continued prosperity. Most people assumed the money was still there. It wasn't. Reason 3. The decline happened slowly enough that it wasn't newsworthy. If the Harrimans had lost everything in a single dramatic scandal, A business collapse, a fraud conviction, a publicized bankruptcy. It would have been big news. But slow erosion over 50 years, gradual asset sales, that's not a headline. That's just the quiet fading of a dynasty, which happens to wealthy families all the time without media attention. Reason 4. Comparing political service to wealth building is considered crass American culture, especially among the educated classes who write history books, elevates public service above profit-seeking. Suggesting that Avril should have focused on business instead of diplomacy sounds like you're saying money matters more than serving your country. But the financial reality is undeniable. Political careers, especially at the level Avril operated, consume wealth rather than create it. Acknowledging this makes people uncomfortable. Reason 5. The beneficiaries of the estate's dissolution had no interest in publicizing it. When Harriman properties were sold or donated, the buyers and recipients, whether that was the state of New York, private purchasers, or charitable foundations, benefited from quiet transactions. Real estate deals at that scale work better without public scrutiny. Nobody wanted attention on the fact that one of America's great dynasties was liquidating assets out of necessity rather than choice. Reason 6. The railroad industry's decline overshadowed the family's personal financial problems. By the 1950s and 1960s, railroads across America were struggling with competition from automobiles, trucks, and airlines. The entire industry was in decline. So when people noticed that the Harriman fortune had diminished, it was easy to attribute it to industry-wide problems rather than specific family mismanagement. The macro explanation obscured the micro-reality. Reason 7. Modern wealth inequality makes Depression-era losses seem distant and irrelevant. Today, we're living in an era where billionaires lose and gain multiple billions in a single day based on stock market fluctuations. Against that backdrop, a family losing $45 million in the 1930s doesn't seem historically significant. But adjusted for inflation and economic context, the Harriman losses were absolutely devastating. We've lost the ability to comprehend what those numbers meant at the time. So there you have it, 7 reasons why the real story of the Harriman family's financial collapse remains largely untold. But the story isn't over yet, because what happened in the final decades shows the ultimate consequence of all these accumulated mistakes. By the 1960s and 1970s, the Harriman fortune was a shadow of what it had been. Let me show you the final numbers. When Avril Harriman died in 1986 at age 94, his estate was valued at approximately $10 million to $20 million. Let me repeat that. $10 million to $20 million. His father had been worth $100 million in 1909. Adjusted for inflation, that's $2.8 billion in 1986 dollars. The family had lost approximately 99% of its wealth in real terms. Gone. Disappeared. Over. But here's what makes this even more remarkable. During those same decades, from 1909 to 1986, other wealthy families had multiplied their fortunes many times over the Rockefeller family fortune, which started around the same level as the Harrimans, had grown to over $11 billion by the 1980s. The difference? Rockefellers created a family office, hired professional managers, diversified investments, and focused obsessively on wealth preservation and growth across generations. The Mellons, another comparable dynasty, had created a banking empire that continued generating enormous wealth through the 20th century. Even families like the Vanderbilts, often cited as examples of squandered fortunes, maintained more wealth than the Harrimans by the 1980s. So what happened in those final decades? How did the liquidation actually play out? Let's walk through it. By the 1950s, most of the Arden estate was gone, sold or donated. The remaining properties were being maintained at a minimal level. The Manhattan townhouse was sold in the 1950s. Another major asset liquidated. The railroad holdings had been reduced significantly. Union Pacific and Southern Pacific stocks that the family still held had recovered somewhat from Depression lows, but the family's ownership stake was a fraction of what E. H. Harriman had controlled. Averill's political career continued through the 1960s. He served as Assistant Secretary of State under Kennedy and Johnson. More public service, more expenses, more years without focusing on wealth building. By the 1970s, Averill was in his 80s. His wife, Pamela Harriman, his third wife, whom he married in 1971, would later become famous in her own right as a political fundraiser and diplomat. But the money was mostly gone. When Averill died in 1986, the will and estate settlement revealed the truth. What remained was comfortable wealth by normal standards, but nowhere near dynasty-level fortune. And here's the final insult. Even that remaining $10 million to $20 million was heavily encumbered by estate taxes, legal fees, and various bequests. By the time everything was settled, the family's financial legacy had essentially evaporated. The Harriman name continued in various institutions: the Harriman Institute at Columbia University, various parks and buildings named after the family. But the wealth that built the dynasty was gone, and almost nobody noticed because it happened so gradually. But that wasn't the real problem. The real problem is that every single mistake that destroyed the Harriman fortune is still happening today, right now. To wealthy families, athletes, entrepreneurs, and lottery winners. Let me show you. Here's what makes the Harriman story so relevant. These same patterns destroy wealth in every generation. Let me give you modern examples: sports stars and single generation. Wealth destruction. Look at the statistics on professional athletes. According to Sports Illustrated, 78% of NFL players face financial distress within 2 years of retirement. 60% of NBA players face the same situation within 5 years. How does this happen? The exact same patterns as the Harrimans. They inherit sudden wealth, in this case from contracts, not family, and immediately start spending on lifestyle, multiple properties, large staff, expensive cars, supporting extended family members, maintaining an image of success. Then the income stops, the career ends, but the expenses continue, just like Averill Harriman spending on politics while railroad dividends disappeared. Tech entrepreneurs and the political spending trap. Look at modern tech billionaires who move into politics or activism. They spend hundreds of millions on political campaigns, think tanks, and policy initiatives. Is this money building wealth? No. It's consuming wealth for influence. Some succeed and their political influence protects or grows their business interests. Many don't. And either way, the money spent on politics is money not compounded in investments. Averill Harriman in a different era. Real estate and the illusion of wealth. Consider modern examples of people who own expensive properties. They can't really afford to maintain the McMansion phenomenon. People with $2 million homes and $150,000 in annual income trying to maintain the property, pay taxes, and fund the lifestyle that goes with that address. They're asset-rich and cash-poor, just like the Harrimans with Arden Estate. And when economic downturns hit, 2008, 2020, the next crash, these properties become anchors that drag people underwater, lottery winners, and instant wealth destruction. Studies show that 70% of lottery winners end up bankrupt within a few years. Why? Same pattern. They receive a massive windfall, let's say $50 million after taxes. Instead of investing it conservatively and living off returns, they immediately scale up their lifestyle to match the lump sum: big house, luxury cars, supporting family and friends, bad business investments, constant spending. Within 5 years, the money is gone. And they're often worse off than before they won because they've taken on massive fixed expenses. Family business succession failures. Research by the Williams Group shows that 70% of wealthy families lose their wealth by the second generation. 90% lose it by the third generation. The pattern. First generation builds the business through obsessive focus, reinvestment, and delayed gratification. Second generation maintains it, but often with less intensity. Third generation inherits money without the skills or mindset that created it, and dissipates it through lifestyle spending and poor management. The Harriman trajectory in miniature. Here's the universal pattern. Display destroys wealth. Savings build it. E.H. Harriman built an empire by relentlessly reinvesting profits, acquiring new assets, and expanding his control. His heirs spent on display, political influence, expensive estates, social standing. One approach compounds wealth, the other consumes it, and the consuming approach always wins in the end if the building approach stops. So let's bring this full circle. The Harriman family didn't fall because of bad luck. They fell because of systematic, repeated financial mistakes that compounded over decades. Here's the breakdown in numbers. Starting point, 1909, $70 million to $100 million, equivalent to $2.8 billion today. Depression losses, 1929 to 1935, approximately $45 million in stock market and business value destruction. Another $10 million to $15 million in lost income from halted dividends. Estate maintenance costs, 1909 to 1986, conservatively $300,000 to $500,000 annually for 77 years. That's $23 million to $38.5 million in total spending just on property maintenance. Adjusted for inflation, that's devastating. Political career opportunity costs, 1933 to 1986. Averill spent roughly 50 years in politics and public service. If the family fortune had been professionally managed and compounded at 5% annually during this period, that $50 million remaining after the Depression could have grown to approximately $570 million by 1986. Instead, it declined to $10 million to $20 million. Family fragmentation losses. Impossible to quantify exactly, but the inefficiency of managing wealth across multiple heirs without unified strategy likely cost tens of millions in suboptimal investment returns, poor business decisions, and unnecessary expenses. Total loss. Over 99% of the family's real wealth in 3 generations. And nobody's talking about this because it undermines 2 powerful American myths. Myth 1. That public service is always noble and costless. Averill Harriman's career is celebrated, and rightfully so in many ways. But there was a real financial cost, not just to him personally, but to the dynasty his father built. Acknowledging this cost doesn't diminish his service, but pretending it didn't exist is dishonest. Myth 2. That wealthy families stay wealthy automatically. We assume that once you reach a certain level of wealth, you're set forever. The Harriman story proves this false. Wealth requires active management, reinvestment, and discipline. Without these, even the largest fortunes can evaporate in a remarkably short time. Here's the message that applies to everyone, not just the wealthy. Every financial decision has an opportunity. Cost money spent on display is money not invested for growth. Money used for influence is money not compounded for security. This doesn't mean never spend. It means understand what you're trading when you do. The Harrimans traded dynasty building for political influence and public service. Was it worth it? That's a values question each person has to answer for themselves. But the financial outcome is undeniable. They went from controlling 60,000 miles of railroad track to leaving an estate worth less than a single successful tech startup founder makes in a good exit. From $100 million to $10 million over 77 years, while other comparable fortunes grew 100 times. That's not preservation, that's systematic liquidation. So let's summarize the chain of events one final time. 1909. E. H. Harriman dies, leaving a $100 million empire built on aggressive reinvestment and hands-on management. The heir is unprepared and uninterested in continuing the business-building approach. 1910 to 1929. Averill Harriman chooses political influence over business growth. Millions are spent on campaigns, estates, and lifestyle. The family maintains appearances but builds nothing new. 1929 to 1935. The Great Depression hits a family that's already financially weakened. Railroad stocks collapse. Income disappears. The fortune shrinks by 50% or more in real terms. 1935 to 1960. Expensive estates become financial anchors. The family sells properties piece by piece while trying to maintain the illusion of continued prosperity. More decades of political career spending drain resources. 1960 to 1986, the final liquidation. The remaining wealth dwindles to a fraction of its former size. By Avril's death, the dynasty is effectively over in financial terms, total time from peak to near complete dissipation. 77 years. 3 generations. And here's the final number that should shock you. If the Harriman fortune had simply been invested in a diversified portfolio of stocks and bonds in 1909 and left to compound at historical market rates of 7% annually, it would have been worth approximately $95 billion by 1986. $95 billion versus $15 million actual. That's the cost of every decision we've discussed, every political campaign, every expensive estate, every year without focused wealth management. Display destroys wealth. Compound growth builds it. This is the principle that separates dynasties that last centuries from those that fade in decades. And nobody's talking about this because acknowledging it means admitting that wealth preservation requires discipline that most people, even most wealthy people, simply don't have. It means admitting that the lifestyle, the influence, the public admiration, all the things that make wealth visible, are often the exact things that destroy it. It means confronting the uncomfortable truth that you can't have both unlimited display and unlimited preservation. The Harrimans chose display. They chose influence. They chose political legacy over financial legacy. And within 3 generations, the empire was gone. But here's what makes this story even more important. The Harriman pattern isn't unique to them. Look at the great American fortunes of the late 1800s and early 1900s, track them forward to today. The Vanderbilt family, worth $200 million at Cornelius Vanderbilt's death in 1877, equivalent to over $6 billion today, had completely dissipated their fortune by the 1970s. When 120 Vanderbilt descendants gathered for a family reunion in 1973, not a single one was wealthy. The Astor family, once the wealthiest in America, saw their fortune fragment and decline through the 20th century, with most descendants living comfortably but not at dynasty levels. The Pulitzer family, the newspaper empire builders, saw their wealth largely evaporate through the mid-20th century. Compare this to families that maintained or grew their wealth. The Rockefellers created a family office in 1882 that still manages multi-billion-dollar fortunes for 6th and 7th generation descendants. They institutionalized wealth management and made preservation a family priority above individual consumption. The DuPonts maintained industrial control and reinvestment discipline for generations. Multiple branches of the family remain extraordinarily wealthy today. The Mars family, the candy and pet food empire, has kept the business private and tightly controlled for over a century. They're now worth over $90 billion collectively, making them one of the wealthiest families in America. What separates these groups? One simple difference: the families that preserved wealth treated it like a business to be managed professionally. The families that lost wealth treated it like a resource to be consumed for lifestyle and influence. The Harrimans fell into the second category. And here's the part that should terrify anyone who's ever received a windfall, built a business, or inherited money. The default trajectory is dissipation, not preservation. Without active discipline management, wealth naturally flows away. Lifestyle expenses naturally increase to match available resources. Family members naturally develop different priorities and split assets. Inflation naturally erodes purchasing power. Preservation is the exception. Dissipation is the rule. The Harrimans simply followed the rule. Let me give you one more angle on this that's rarely discussed: the specific financial mechanics of how political careers consume wealth. When someone like Avril Harriman enters politics at the level he did, not as a local politician but as a national and international figure, the costs go far beyond campaign contributions. Here's what it actually requires. First, you need multiple residences. You can't be a serious political figure with just one home. You need a place in Washington when you're in government service. You need a home in your state or district when you're running for office. You need a social headquarters for hosting events. Avril maintained all of these simultaneously for decades. Second, you need a full social calendar. Politics at that level is about relationships, dinners, events, fundraisers. Every event costs money: the venue, the catering, the staff. Even when you're the guest rather than the host, you're expected to reciprocate. This creates a constant cycle of expensive social obligations. Third, you need staff beyond what government provides: personal assistants, advisors, advance teams, speechwriters, researchers. Some of this is covered by campaigns or government positions, but much of it must be paid privately, especially in the gaps between positions. Fourth, you need to maintain the appearance of success. Image matters enormously in politics. You can't show up to high-level meetings looking like you're struggling financially. The clothes, the cars, the travel arrangements, all of it has to project confidence and prosperity. Fifth, you need liquidity. Political opportunities come suddenly. A campaign starts with 6 months' notice. A diplomatic posting requires immediate relocation. You need cash available to seize these opportunities, which means keeping money in low-return liquid assets rather than long-term investments. Add all of this up, and a serious political career at the national level can easily consume $500,000 to $1 million per year in modern dollars. Across 50 years, that's $25 million to $50 million in direct costs alone. Now add the opportunity cost, the returns you would have earned if that money had been invested instead, and you're looking at $100 million to $200 million in total economic impact. Averell Harriman paid that price: his choice, his values, his legacy. But the financial consequence was dynasty destruction. And nobody talks about this because we're not supposed to calculate the dollar cost of public service. It seems crass, unpatriotic, ungrateful. But the numbers don't lie. So how do you know if you're following the Harriman pattern? Here are the warning signs. Warning sign 1. Your expenses are increasing as fast as or faster than your income. If you're earning more but saving the same percentage or less, you're on the consumption treadmill. This is what happened to the Harrimans post 1909. Income from railroads was substantial, but expenses grew to match and then exceed it. Warning sign 2. You're spending significant money on influence rather than assets. Whether that's political donations, social positioning, status symbols, or networking investments, if the money isn't going into appreciating assets or income-generating businesses, it's consumption disguised as investment. Warning sign 3. Your real estate holdings cost more to maintain than they generate in value. If your properties require constant cash infusions for maintenance, taxes, and upkeep without producing rental income or appreciation, they're anchors. The Harrimans learned this too late. Warning sign 4. You're making career choices based on prestige rather than economics. If you're turning down high-paying opportunities for lower-paying prestigious positions, you're trading wealth for status. Sometimes that's the right choice, but be honest about what you're trading. Warning sign 5. Your wealth is fragmented across family members without unified management. When everyone controls their own portion and makes their own decisions, you lose the compounding power of concentrated capital and professional management. Warning sign 6. You don't know your annual burn rate. If you can't tell me exactly how much you spent last year and whether it was more or less than your income, you're not managing wealth, you're just spending it. Warning sign 7. You assume your current wealth level is permanent. The moment you stop actively preserving and building, you start dissipating. There is no plateau, only growth or decline. The Harrimans exhibited every single one of these warning signs for 77 years straight. The result was inevitable. Let me give you the final numbers one more time, because this is the part that needs to sink in. E. H. Harriman's empire in 1909, $100 million in assets, equivalent to $2.8 billion today, 60,000 plus miles of railroad track, 100,000 plus employees. Control over the economic lifelines of the American West, income generation capacity of $350 million annually. The Harriman legacy in 1986, $10 to $20 million in estate value, equivalent to $28 to $56 million today. No railroad control, no industrial empire, no income-generating assets of significance. One lifetime of political influence and public service. The net result, 99% reduction in real wealth over 3 generations. Or looked at another way, if the 1909 fortune had grown at just 3% real return annually, far below market averages, it would have been worth $830 million by 1986. At market average returns of 7%, it would have been worth $95 billion. Instead, $15 million. The gap between those numbers represents every decision we've discussed, every campaign contribution, every year of public service instead of business building, every expensive estate maintained for appearance, every family conflict over asset control, every year without professional wealth management. That gap is the cost of choosing legacy over liquidity, influence over investment, display over discipline. And here's what's important. This isn't a tragedy. It's not even necessarily a mistake, depending on your values. Averell Harriman had a remarkable life. He negotiated with Stalin. He helped design the Marshall Plan. He served his country at the highest levels for half a century. He was present at some of the most important moments of the 20th century. Maybe that was worth $2.8 billion. Maybe influence and historical impact matter more than money in the bank. But let's be crystal clear about what the trade was. Let's not pretend the Harrimans remained wealthy when they objectively didn't by dynasty standards. Let's not ignore the financial reality because the political legacy is admirable. The Harriman family chose a path. That path had consequences. And those consequences follow mathematical laws that don't care about good intentions, public service, or historical importance. Spend more than you earn. You go broke, fail to reinvest, growth stops, consume instead of compound, wealth disappears. These laws applied to the Harrimans in 1909. They apply to everyone today. So here's the question that matters. What are you trading? Every time you spend on lifestyle instead of investing, you're trading future compounding for present consumption. Are you making that trade consciously or just drifting into it? Every time you take a lower-paying, prestigious position instead of a higher-paying business role, you're trading income for status. Do you understand the long-term cost of that trade? Every time you maintain expensive assets that don't generate returns, you're trading liquidity for appearance. Is that trade worth it to you? Every time you fragment your wealth across family members without professional management, you're trading efficiency for independence. Are you sure that's the right choice? The Harrimans made all of these trades repeatedly for 77 years. They traded a railroad empire for political influence. They traded compounding wealth for social standing. They traded dynasty building for individual ambitions. And in the end, they got exactly what they traded for. Averell Harriman has his name in history books. The family has its legacy of public service. Various institutions bear the Harriman name. But the wealth, the empire, the economic power that E.H. Harriman spent his life building, gone, disappeared, over. And nobody's talking about this because the full story, the one with detailed financial numbers, the unflattering decisions, the systematic wealth destruction, doesn't fit neatly into the public service narrative that historians prefer. But the numbers don't lie. The trajectory is clear. The pattern is undeniable. The Harriman family fell because they stopped building and started consuming, because they chose display over discipline, because they treated a fortune as a resource to spend rather than a system to manage, and they're not alone. This same pattern has destroyed hundreds of wealthy families over the past century. It's destroying wealthy families right now. It will destroy wealthy families in the future. Unless they learn the lesson the Harrimans never did. Display destroys wealth. Compound growth builds it. Choose accordingly. Choose. This is Old Money Walls, where we track where the money really goes. Not the public story, not the sanitized biography, the actual numbers, the real decisions, the financial consequences that historians ignore because they're too focused on legacy to examine balance sheets. The Harriman Empire was worth $100 million in 1909. By 1986, it was worth $15 million. That's a 99% loss in real terms, while comparable families multiplied their wealth 100-fold. How did it happen? Unprepared heirs, political spending over business building. The Great Depression hitting an already weakened fortune, expensive estates that consumed rather than generated wealth, family fragmentation without unified management. 77 years of systematic financial mistakes that compounded into complete dynasty destruction. And nobody's talking about this because acknowledging it means admitting that wealth requires discipline, that public service has real costs, and that even the greatest fortunes can evaporate in 3 generations without proper management. The Harrimans chose influence over investments, legacy over liquidity, display over discipline, and they paid the price entirely, completely. If you want to see how another American dynasty destroyed itself, this time through even more spectacular spending on architecture, parties, and social competition, watch our next video on the Vanderbilt family collapse, because the same pattern destroyed them too, just with even bigger houses and faster dissipation. This is Old Money Walls, where we follow the money, not the mythology.